Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's October 27th, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Hey, Eric, unbelievably good. When last we left our hero listeners, we were taking a week off because I had surgery planned. Well, I've had the surgery, and everything I'm about to say, I can take no credit for because I slept through it. So, Dr. Kim Brown, if you're listening to this or to anyone who's in Austin, everything I'm about to say is credit to Dr. Brown and her team. The pathology report is about as good as it can be. So I've got distance to travel in this fight. I think radiation's coming next, but for where I am, it's unbelievable. So thanks, Dr. Brown. Thanks, Christina. Thanks, team. And I decided to wear a white shirt to match my flowing white locks that are coming back in. So it's it's an all recovery celebration day for us.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
A lot to be grateful for and very lucky too, because I don't know that it always goes as well as it did. So glad to have you back.
Thanks. And for everyone that fights the cancer fight, there are good days, bad days. There are days when you Snoopy dance like I'm doing right now. I think everyone knows that, and I've said this before, I think the hardest thing about cancer is it steals your innocence before you have it. If you're feeling kind of you're like, I'm either getting old or I have a cold. And once you've had cancer, it's kind of with you for a long time, and that it's lurking and you're probably going to have to fight it again. So for all my fellow cancer fighters, you know how I feel when it's a good day. And I know that there are other days that are not so good where you just have to screw up your courage and fight anew. And I'm here with you. And there are a lot of us doing this.
That's right. Big day on Friday as well. Do y'all carve pumpkins historically, or are you pumpkin painters?
Oh, goodness, no. We are and have always been pumpkin carvers, and like every other celebration in my family's life, we are panic pumpkin carvers. By that I mean we always tried to get off work early enough so that we could carve our pumpkin before the first trick-or-treater showed up. So definitely pumpkin carvers. And as the kids got older, and I think even after they left home, Jim and I became kind of obsessed with how clever could we be with our pumpkin carving. And I think my favorite pumpkin that we ever carved was one that had the symbol for 3.14159. Yes, the symbol for pie. So we made pumpkin pie. That was my favorite one. Nerdy, but it made us happy.
That's good. Yeah. We haven't carved ours yet. And I think part of that is they've been deflating so much in the past couple of years. Like, you carve it and then you go back the next day and look at it and it's just all drooped over and like it melted.
Like its dentures are gone.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what causes that. I don't remember that happening as much. Like the pumpkins would last for weeks, but I don't know. Maybe it's preservatives or resistant bacteria now. I don't know.
So how many pumpkins do you do? For most of our years, we did one family pumpkin. We probably started doing more as our children wanted to express their own artistry. But how many pumpkins do you do? One for each?
Yeah, everybody will get one. And I think our 5-year-old wants 2 this year. He said he's got at least 2 designs he wants to do. So he'll get at least a double.
And your 11-month-old, he gets a pumpkin?
Yeah, he'll get one. We'll carve something fun for him.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we need for our video viewers, maybe next week we can take a picture of your, 5 or 6 pumpkins. Yeah,
we'll do.
I love it.
All right. Let's get to some headlines then. Full steam ahead on AUKUS, submarines and rare earths. We'll discuss the agreements with Australia and the U.S. impacting Indo-Pacific security. Did Washington greenlight deeper Ukrainian strikes while slapping Russia's oil giants? We'll discuss Army Secretary Dan Driscoll's vow to torch acquisition red tape and completely disrupt the acquisition cycle? Can he blow up the military-industrial complex as we know it? Bailouts and beef and Beijing. Is a $40 billion lifeline to Buenos Aires an America first bet or just a pile of cow shit? Great Scott, did someone hack the clock tower? Beijing says NSA breached China's master clock. Mess with microseconds and you can crash more than DeLoreans. And finally, Trump's Asia swing tees up a Xi summit. 100% tariffs on ice, rare earth curbs paused, and farm buys back on. Tokyo's watching the ripple effects.
Wow, what a set of topics. Busy.
Yeah, we got a little bit to catch up on.
Busy world, indeed.
Yep. So we'll update AUKUS first. President Trump met with the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese at the White House, where they signed a deal on rare earths, about an $8.5 billion pipeline with at least $1 billion in the next 6 months of joint investment. This is to expand non-China mining, processing primarily, and price backstop mechanisms. Then, President Trump publicly backed the AUKUS submarine agreement, pushing to accelerate the sale of Virginia-class submarines and keep the SSN AUKUS on track, an explicit signal of long-horizon deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. In episode 2 of the Understandable Insights podcast, we discussed rare earth production and the ability of MP materials to increase domestic refinement. And in episode 10, we discussed the AUKUS agreement and Anduril's award of the Ghost Shark undersea unmanned submarine. Sue, what are your thoughts on these two agreements in the past couple weeks?
Yeah, I love them both. I'm really excited that the administration found the time to advance these initiatives. One, just what they represent tangibly. Good for the U.S. to be jointly producing submarines for Australia. Really good to have an alternative supply of rare earth minerals that isn't China-based for all the reasons that you said, not only the supply, but also being able to do some price management on that. So I like this. These are really sound fundamental things. I mean, I'm probably showing some of my career-long bias of really loving to work with the Aussies. But I also like it because of where Australia is geographically. To have such a strong relationship and to be investing in it in a strong way in the region that is most up for grabs in the Indo-Pacific region, I think is super important. I love Australia as a partner, and I think they have a lot of power in terms of countering China because they aren't just adversarial, they are a necessary trading partner. In some ways, as the U.S. is, not like the U.S., a different kind of trading partner, but as the U.S. is, that I think it gives us real opportunity because it isn't so easy for China to ignore dealing with Australia and the things they do. So you're kind of putting economic pressure as well as security pressure in the region at a time we really need to be doing it. So I like this. Bravo.
Yeah, I think we were a little nervous about the
Mhm.
review coming in of the AUKUS agreement.
Yeah.
We thought that was going to be really important, and glad to see that the administration saw it the same way.
Yeah, still more to do, but I don't think you could have had two better decisions to allow those to move forward and to kind of normalize relationships. 'Cause I think our allies and partners are a little skitterish right now, just not totally being sure what kind of partner the U.S. is going to be with all the tariff moves. And I think this also just solidifies a rock solid partner in a region that we care about.
Yep, absolutely. And we'll talk now about some other allies. 2 moves last week in terms of Ukraine. Reports that the U.S. lifted a key restriction on Kyiv's use of Western long-range missiles to strike inside Russia, and new U.S. sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's 2 biggest oil companies. The Wall Street Journal reported that Ukraine used a British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missile on Tuesday, 10/21, to strike a Russian plant about 500 kilometers northeast of Kyiv. That produced explosives and rocket fuel. Ukraine called the strike a successful hit that penetrated Russian air defenses. President Trump was quick to dispute this claim on a Truth Social post, stating that the report was false and that the U.S. has, quote, nothing to do with those missiles. Well, that's not entirely accurate. The U.S. can restrict Ukraine's use of the Storm Shadow because the missile uses American targeting data, but that was already authorized a few weeks ago. Storm Shadow, the missile used, is a joint venture between France and the UK and produced in the UK. It is launched from aircraft and can travel more than 180 miles, but this is significantly less than a US produced Tomahawk with a range of about 1,000 miles. With respect to tariffs and the economic impact on Russia, that's likely to be minimal. But the change is somewhat in this foreign policy and the administration having previously said they wouldn't impose sanctions unless European nations cease buying Russian oil. They're still buying. But the sanctions did come a few days after the UK sanctioned the same Russian oil companies. The European Union has also issued their own new sanctions that ban the import of Russian liquefied natural gas, but that's not beginning until January of 2027. Yes, 2027. How does that help? So my question for you, Sue, was how do we measure success here? Are you happy with these developments, or what kind of concrete milestones or things should we be watching for in the coming weeks and months to ensure that these things are actually working?
I always feel like every time we talk about Ukraine, we're putting pressure on a different party, and then we walk that pressure back about a minute later. But let's just take this as a fixed point in time and talk about it. Number one, Russia's position vis-a-vis Ukraine just isn't sustainable over the long haul. They are really, really struggling. The president talks about the cost in human lives. There are not only human lives, but you are just taking strategic resources down to the bone. You're running out of humans of warfighting age. You're causing a society to be mired in a endless war that to them means as little as it seems to mean when we look at it to them.
Yeah.
And Putin's only hope is if he can convince Trump to put pressure on Ukraine to end it in a favorable way. So I think
Yeah.
that's kind of the meta picture. So I love ratcheting up the pressure on Russia, whether that is through allowing Ukraine to do more or to actually squeeze Russia. If you go back to the Biden administration, I think there are a whole bunch of people that would say that they weren't massively satisfied with Biden's commitment to Ukraine, that there were several times in that war that it felt like we needed to provide more resources so that we could press the advantage to really put Russia to that moment of choice. The administration never seemed to make that choice of overcommitting. And it felt to me like we were kind of heading toward an Afghan situation where you could hold steady on the 30-yard line, but you were never going to get to the 50 and you might be pushed back into the insult. I like the addition of pressure. I don't mind where these sanctions are starting. They have to be upheld, and I think you have to enforce them. We don't have any idea whether he's really going to go to tomahawks or not. What I will say to America is the more pressure we put on, the more nuclear saber rattling Russia is going to do, because they know, because the president has foretold this, that is a bridge too far for him. And when there is nuclear saber rattling, then he will do something to try and ease it. The fact that Russia backed off on the in-person talks, I think again shows that this was a real pressure move that has caused Putin to go back and think about, what am I going to do now? A lot like AUKUS, I like the direction, even though in this case, we've been at this moment before, and we've also seen that a countermove by Russia can often change the president's position on this. But for today, October 27th, I think it's in the direction of goodness.
Yep.
How about you?
I like it. I don't expect us to give them access to Tomahawks. I don't expect that at all. I think that's a bridge too far. But to strike 180 miles inside Russian territory and continue pushing that line further and further, if they're able to advance and affect that some of those resources that Russia's using for the war effort, I think that's great.
Yeah, I believe that one of the things that's going to have to happen is Europe is going to have to continue to be serious. Remember when right after Alaska, there was real scurrying in Europe and real energy around supporting Ukraine? I think this is one of these cases where the more Europe can be in the lead, even if it's the U.S. buttressing them, I think the more likely it is going to be successful. When the U.S. gets isolated and Europe goes quiet on the things they're doing, I think Putin thinks he has an advantage, and one of the things for us to watch for is just because President Trump has leapt back into the fray with a couple of these moves, what Europe and NATO need to do is they really need to continue to up their investment and their pressure, because them leading an international coalition will be much more powerful than the U.S. leading one.
Yep, for sure. And I like that President Trump didn't go to Hungary to meet with
Totally.
Putin. And he was like, Vladimir keeps saying the right things. We have great conversations. And then he turns around and doesn't do what we talked about.
Yeah, for whatever reason, this is a hard relationship for President Trump to manage. I think we said early on, the president likes having friendships and strong relationships with his partners, and that's his going in position is they're my friend. I'm going to talk to them. They like me. Whatever you think about that is his strategy. The deal is about Putin. He's not your friend.
No.
He's not afraid of you. And he's really good at the trade craft of human engagement. That's who he came from. He's a KGB officer, and Putin is a tough one because this is a pro's pro, and so you can't go thinking that you're gonna snooker him into something. It's too hard in engagement. Plus, just dogmatically, Putin believes and has a long-term strategy of basically recapturing the glory of the Soviet Union days, and so he isn't gonna walk away from this one easily. We're gonna have to be strong enough to make him.
Yep, completely agree. Well, let's talk about some Army acquisitions and making some
Yeah.
new purchases of weapons, maybe for the U.S. and the Ukrainian war effort. And I think some of the lessons learned out of Ukraine have some influence here in terms of their acquisition cycle and how quickly they're turning it around. The Army is signaling a wholesale reset of how it buys. Secretary Dan Driscoll says he's preparing reforms that will, quote, completely disrupt the acquisition bureaucracy, backed by unprecedented top cover from the Trump administration. The system as it stands, he says, is much too slow and costly and serves to, quote, line the prime contractors' pockets. Early markers point to streamlining offices and processes, expanding rapid pathways, for example, MTA, adding right to repair for resilience, and tapping private capital for infrastructure and tech enablers. I frickin' love it. I'm in favor of blowing up the acquisition process. It's too long, too bureaucratic, and too much analysis of the numbers and not how it impacts the warfighter. In episode 2, we talked about the drone exercise in Alaska and how far behind we are in terms of the acquisition cycle. At an annual Association of the U.S. Army conference in Washington, D.C., the secretary had a prop that he put up, a 3D printed Black Hawk tail that he cited as a third the cost. The vendor charged $14,000 for this part, and his team 3D printed it for $3,000, and it was 300% stronger. This type of language is exactly what Trump 2.0 has advertised. Sue, do you think Double D can pull this one off?
Well, I certainly love it. Even though we hated the kind of non-disciplined Doge approach, we both have believed that the government is too slow and too bureaucratic to keep up with what the real advantage in 2025 is speed. So I love it. I think he absolutely is representing a portion of what the Trump administration really wants. Just remember, I know that all the services might seem like their own thing. The Army is so huge because it's involved in everything. I don't care which of the other services you are, you need the Army to help you with logistics. And so just their footprint is massive. So the Army being kind of on the front foot of acquisition reform, I think is really good for the nation. The Air Force has always been there. Frank Kendall, the previous Secretary of the Air Force, and I think the new current Secretary is also there, Troy Mink. But for the Army to be on its front foot, I think is a really, really great sign just because of the volumetric issues. So that's all my happiness. So all my happiness is with yours. Here's my one caveat. The cuts to government, the cuts to the acquisition workforce, the cuts to the second and third level political appointees that are generally leading the units that have control over some of this decision making have really slowed the decision making. You can have all the intention in the world, but if you don't have the workforce to be able to implement what you've just said, you can have intention and capabilities sitting across a chasm you just can't cross. So I think on the one hand, everyone's kind of excited to go in this, well, not everyone. A lot of people are excited to go in this direction. But some of the other actions of the administration to really strip the professional cadre of the government is going to make this a little harder because brand new acquisition officers might be less willing to do something that seems more risky than to just follow the process. There used to be that old saying that says nobody gets fired for hiring Big Blue, IBM. And so I worried that that could be a little bit. Then the second thing about this is, okay, those big primes that have just
Yeah.
been excoriated, they're not gonna sit back lightly and just say, "Yeah, you're right. We're not doing it right." They are one, to be clear, they have delivered the technical superiority that the US has depended on for decades. And so number 1, don't be sleeping on the capability that they actually have, even if they have grown governmental in the sense of getting too big, too expensive, and a little too slow. They still have remarkable capability, and the other thing they have is a remarkable lobby. And so this is all fun and games, but don't be confused. There are gonna be representatives of those companies going into Congress and telling them all the things that are wrong with going exclusively with the little guy
Yep.
approach. So expect to see some toing and froing on this. And then there's a third party in there that is neither one of the two things we're talking about, which is the little companies, the ones that can do the 3D printed Black Hawk tail. And then there are the new kids like Anduril and Anthropic and Scale AI that are trying to be the new primes. So they're still toing and froing on who's going to win. And the last thing I'll say is this government shutdown, I suspect, really highlights one of the very real reasons that acquirers are sometimes loath to go with a small company, even when they love the capability, is can they be confident that if something bad happens, that company will be able to continue producing even in a time of hardship? And it's just a truism that the big primes have more money that they can rely on when things are slow than the smaller ones do. So I love that he's there. I love that it's the Army that's out there. I think the Trump administration does want this to happen, but it's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride, and we'll end up with something that's a little bit more of a mix approach, and that's probably right.
Yeah, I think any improvement is going to be better. But man, you talk about a complicated system to try to get something into the hands of the people who need to use it. It's just only gotten more and more complicated.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that is a corollary thrust is when the US decides that it's going to buy a bespoke capability that a company builds exclusively for it, and that acquisition takes 10 years to deliver a product, what's the likelihood that product it delivers after 10 years is going to be the most representative of new technologies? And so we
Yeah, it's already
also
10 years
had
old.
and so this is why you hear a real push by commercial companies say, "If you'll buy commercial, we're always upgrading our product. You can always have the most current product if you can find your way to be able to use a commercial capability." There are a lot of different flavors of this argument. One of the things to look at is a 10-year acquisition cycle or a system engineering process that doubles the price for something that is gonna be obsolete quicker and has to turn over is just not the right approach. There's a lot of change that needs to be made.
Yep. Cost, schedule, performance.
Yep.
You have to trade off one of them in order to increase the others. I also wanted to ask you about this emphasis on private capital that he was talking about. So he wants to use private capital to close this giant funding gap. Secretary Driscoll cites that the Army needs about $150 billion in capital over the next decade, but they only have $15 billion in budget, so a whole order of magnitude off. And he's inviting private equity and infrastructure funds to finance some of this big ticket stuff. He's pitching deals that will use underutilized Army land and depots for projects like AI-grade data centers for rare earth processing, stuff like that. He wants to speed up the pipeline, complements his Silicon Valley acquisition model. So reminded me of your Incatel background there. And then he also wants to shift the risk from the Army's balance sheet, give some of these private companies to invest. But we've talked about that before. That's one of the best things the government has is that they've got the deep pockets and the long time horizon, and they're willing to invest in things that might not be in the best interest of the company on its own because they may not have that return. So what can he trade? He's got to incentivize these companies to do it. I guess land is one of them because we talked about building the data centers, access to some of those resources. But do you see this as representative of private investment in this administration? They've also taken donations for the ballroom. There was a donation last week from a wealthy benefactor, $130 million to go pay the troops. Is this kind of a new way of funding, or how do you view this private equity investment in the Army?
So let's take two pieces of that one. The first piece you mentioned, I think the private capital is there and they are absolutely ready to put it to use. This is a really great time to do that. Here's the problem. What you're going to trade for it is sales.
Right.
And the problem that we always have is that we know the type of capabilities we want. We get the investors to invest, but we don't have the promise of the requirement on the other end to know that when they build it, it's going to fit and be able to put into use. So I think the thing that needs to be fixed in this is not the access to private equity, because I think it's there. There are various funds that are out there that have been set up and are trying to offer really attractive things to the government. And the government has set up really purpose-built elements to be able to go after and work with them. But the problem is what they want is money.
Yeah.
And the money comes when you get a sale, and the money from sales comes when you put a lot of them into use. And what we haven't fixed yet in the government is how to be as clear with these kind of commercial providers about what it is we need than we were when we provided the specs for the bespoke providers to build exactly what we wanted so that we knew when it was built, it was put to use. And so something's got to give. Either the government's got to give much more clarity about exactly what it wants to these private funders so that when they find someone to build it, we know that it will be the right thing. Or we're going to be left with the same problem. We're going to have a whole bunch of really great stuff out there that's almost good enough and never gets into play. Gets to how do you get into use problem. That's the much bigger one than how do you find money to fund it problem. Then the other one you mentioned is just all these private investors. I got to tell you, maybe this is what happens to people my age when we realize we've just gotten old and we can't decide whether we're just old and out of touch or whether we know something that other people don't. Private investment in government projects is a slippery slope. Seriously, I used to donate my time. So my paycheck was for 8 hours a week, 8.5, because they allowed me a half-hour lunch break.
8 hours a day.
8 hour days. I
Yeah.
probably averaged somewhere between 12 and 16 hours a day for my career. Somewhere toward the end of my career, someone said, "You're doing something illegal. You're not allowed to give the government things. You're not allowed to gift it to the government because you're setting up an implicit, now do you have power? Do they owe you something back for that?" The government doesn't take gifts, except in very specific, very well thought, very papered over cases.
Yep.
And so we're doing this like chiclets. And I worry. It's on the top line for a wealthy citizen decide that he wants to give $130 million for service member pay. I think that's a great idea. It doesn't cover the number of service members we have. So that's
No, it was like $100 for each service member.
But what's the expectation? And once he's given it to him, does he have some expectation in return when he wants to get his kid into the U.S. military academy? I just don't like setting up quid pro quos for the government, even though I love a spirit of volunteerism that I think actually the nation has long held. I think wanting to do something for the country is not exclusively for those people who work for the government. I think there are patriots all over. I think we really need to be careful about this private investment in government projects to be making sure that we are not inadvertently setting up an expectation that then that person can come and turn around and expect something in return.
No, that's a great point. And that's what Secretary Driscoll and the acquisitions reform on the Army side and then the government side is able to do is eliminate maybe that black hole where, hey, the warfighter and the contractor come together and say, this is the capability
Right.
I need. And then it goes in this black box and something else completely different comes out.
Right.
to the warfighter or to the actual worker. That is what needs to change because, like you said, the private investment is there. The companies are there willing to do it. We've just got this system that's not talking.
Yeah, and just Eric, I know I'm a broken record on this and talking about you want the government to be slow, not as slow as it is, but you want it to be slow. But mostly what you want is a system that people can count on to understand to work. What this moment is about is the systems we have in plate are completely ill-suited to the requirements that we have.
Yep.
They're not well suited to where we take risk anymore. They're not suited to the speed of the world that needs to be. But you still can't afford to be doing a bunch of one-offs because
Hmm.
what about the next company that isn't attractive to a private equity investor that doesn't get built, but it somehow has this special path in? So the hard thing about government, this is about acquisition, but it's also about just laws and amendments and how we approach things is
Hmm.
it's okay to change. I love change, but you have to change with a new system, not change with just a new decision.
Yeah, and if you go too far to one direction, you
Yeah,
want to be responsive, not
right, right,
reactionary, right?
exactly.
And so
Got
you
it.
need some element of slowness. You can't just completely move fast and break things. But the iteration cycle in Ukraine was what, 6 weeks from which they turned drones around, or they'd see something on the battlefield, they'd go back, they'd build it, and they'd have a new drone. Like we are 6+ years.
Totally. And this is where risk is. When I mentioned risk before, is when your risk is you're going to build one tank every 20 years, you better make sure it's right. If your drone's gonna be shot out of the sky and you can rebuild it with the next drone, you don't have to take that amount of time in order to build the drone. The risk equation, same with cyber, right?
Uh,
It used to be that you feared getting caught with any cyber action you were doing. Now everyone knows that everyone's doing cyber action. So if you're not using that domain, you're not gonna be as effective as you need to be. Risk changes over time, and you need to account for that.
yeah, for sure. And we'll talk a little bit more about return on investment here in this next segment. With Argentina's president, Javier Milei, met with President Trump at the White House, and the U.S. is orchestrating a $40 billion lifeline for Argentina, combining a $20 billion Treasury currency swap backstop with a proposed $20 billion in financing from Wall Street, banks, and other private lenders that will stabilize the Argentinian peso. It's been framed as an attempt to keep Buenos Aires aligned with Washington over Beijing and pry Argentina out of China's orbit. Argentina joined China's Belt and Road Initiative in February 2022, a move formalized under the previous president, Alberto Fernandez. President Trump also suggested to boost Argentine beef imports to cool U.S. prices, but in doing so angered a large section of his base. The ranchers are pissed. While beef prices are at or near all-time highs in October 2025, the ranchers say that this is just a recovery period for them after overextending and taking loans to cover previous years. This timing is significant because over the weekend, Milei's party pulled off a stunning win in legislative elections that boost his abilities to push forward an overhaul of this economy. So this aligns with the administration's focus on hard power through military force, economic sanctions, and payments, as opposed to soft power projection. I like Argentina personally. Got some family friends that live down there, and I'm also having a hard time seeing the return on investment, potentially the ROI, on our America First agenda. Sue, what do you think?
Yeah, I can see Argentina as a wedge against China. China is making huge inroads, has made huge inroads into South America, as has Russia, just not with quite as much fanfare. And so, different from what we're doing with Venezuela, to do something through investment with a friendly regime isn't a horrible idea. But I, like you, can't quite see exactly how this comes back around. I'd like a little more clarity on that. And more than that, it's not obvious. Economic woes are not new to Argentina. And I'm not sure that the new president instills confidence that he knows how to turn it around economically. And putting aside the boost the bond market had today that says, oh, see, it's turning around. Yeah, it's a lot longer turnaround than that. So this is an area where the Trump administration has really fallen down in general with the American people when they have walked away from any public discourse, any use of Congress, who, by the way, are made up of the people's representative, about the strategy they're using, the theory of the case, and really testing and explaining and having briefings to say, here's exactly how it's going to work. And so to me, the risk of a whole bunch of actions using the people's money, because
Yep.
it is. And I saw Scott Bessent this weekend say, oh, no, these are my funds. They may be in a fund that is used for currency bolstering, but
Sure.
it's still the American people's money given to you. And so I guess my super problem, hierarchically, the highest level problem I have is we aren't having any national discussion about any of these priorities, whether the justification for them, the expectations with them, or the ROI from them. And that, with the lack of clarity about demonstrable returns from any of the previous actions, I think you're just building up, stacking up issues that are likely to not be as successful as we'd hoped, or will have to be lied about to prove that they are. So it's not a zero idea, but I don't see it, especially as there are other allies and partners who probably could use some bolstering as well.
Yep.
Yeah, tough one. I think the combination of the tariffs' impact on America's heartland, and depending on what the president uses to cut the deals with the various people he's negotiating with now, I can see those two things coming crashing together in some really unexpectedly poor ways. But time will tell.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe this helps drive a better wedge between them and China and get some more US investment down the road. But in 2002, Argentina also tried to go to the dollar and dollarization of their currency, which is what Milei is proposing now. And they ended up defaulting $93 billion in debt. I don't know.
Yeah,
Is that super clear to me how this is different than that time?
I think it bears watching. We did it. We'll be able to see. Eric, am I the only one that would just like to see maybe the balance sheet of the U.S. Treasury so I could see the gazintas and gazatas of all these deals? Because, man, I hear numbers. I don't see the impact of the influx of dollars
Yeah,
into
that
U.S.
that sounds
government.
great.
Yeah,
All these numbers sound great.
I know they do. But on the other hand, if we've really taken in $20 trillion, why are we having a government shutdown? Why don't we just pay for all the things that we say we can't afford to? I don't know. I'd feel better, I think, if I could hold on to data.
Yeah, the guys who review the data are out to lunch. Congress and the power of the purse. The
Yeah.
guys who are supposed to be spending the monies.
My gosh, you guys, come on. This is Sue's weekly paid political announcement. Guys, do your jobs. Okay, that was my message to Congress.
President Trump is in Asia. His trip here, he's in Asia, Malaysia, Japan, then South Korea, where he's expected to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the end of the journey. U.S. and Chinese negotiators have already sketched a framework that would avert the threatened 100% tariffs, pause China's rare earth export curbs, and revive some U.S. agricultural purchases while leaders prep for the Trump-Xi meeting. Tokyo is using the visit to lock in steadier trade ties with D.C., while watching how the U.S.-China thaw affects supply chain, deterrence math, and the Indo-Pacific. So what are your thoughts on this trip?
Well, I'm glad to see him going. You know, if we had pre-Trump presidency, if he had walked into what was his most pressing national security issue, certainly it was China. Good timing on this trip to go and do it, especially after all the other places that we've been focused. I like that. You know, when the president makes a trip, a regional trip of this sort, typically is doing two things. One is having hard conversations with the major players. So sitting down with China, where they're sometimes delivering difficult messages, sometimes coming up with great agreements that move us forward. So I expect that is what he's trying to do with China. There are a lot of things that we need to work out with China, from straight up security to economic considerations. But the other thing he tries to do is with all the other powers in the region is to do some just relationship building,
Yep.
particularly the Indo-Pacific region. Some of the conversations we had about the fallout of particularly difficult Trump tariff stances, allies and partners who turn away from us now turning to Russia and China as partners.
Yeah.
So you're trying to keep the other nations of the region to be good partners with us and to feel loved and to have some relationship. So I think he's going to try and do some of both from a top line perspective. I think we're going to come out with pretty much the same tariff level that we've had before, maybe some easing with China, but it takes it back to the one that he had agreed to 6 months ago. It's always good to have relationships with the leader of China because we are so intertwined economically. And when we're at economic war or physical war, it isn't good for the world, right? So good. With everyone else, I think there's going to be a lot of maybe some small agreements, a lot of fanfare, and a lot of celebratory things we've already seen in Malaysia. I think Japan is interesting because the new prime minister looks
Yeah.
very much like the leader of Italy and I'm going to say the counter leader in Venezuela, very much on the Trump kind of right wing side of things. And so I think there's real potential there for that to be a relationship that's as solid as it was with Abe. Now, what it turns into in terms of tariffs and economic and joint development is interesting. But I think a great relationship with Japan may be set up because of the new prime minister. I think the tough one is South Korea. The president has always had a kind of difficult relationship with South Korea, viewing us as spending too much money for the troops that we put there in his mind to protect them from North Korea,
Yeah.
always wanting more from them in order to house those troops. They are one of the largest free economies, and so super important to us to keep them as a trading partner and in the free and open society column. But we did just kick out, 300 of their workers unceremoniously from a Hyundai plant. And so I think he's got a little bit of explaining to do. So I think watching what happens with South Korea could be one of the most interesting ones because we really need them. He has said that he wants to see Kim Jong-un while he's there. I I don't see how that's an add-on, but
Right.
I'm just saying from North Koreans' perspective, if he seems open to it, it only benefits them.
Sure.
So don't be surprised if that happens, although from my former position, I'm like, wait, you're also going to do that?
Yeah, I'm in the neighborhood. I'll just
Yeah, right.
pop on by.
We'd be like, oh my God, we didn't prepare you. And he'd be like, I don't need any preparation. Then we'd all be incredibly afraid. This is an important trip just because of the things that happen in that region and how much they can affect not only U.S. health and stability, military, politically, but mostly economically. But I wouldn't expect a lot of change from what we have already. Don't expect some brand new breakthrough deal. Even if the words around whatever deal they come up with are brand new and
Sure.
breakthrough, I think it's going to be pretty much what we have already, just more normalization.
In cyber news, China just accused the U.S., specifically the NSA, of a major cyber attack on its National Time Service Center, which is the backbone that synchronizes comms, finance, power, transportation, and defense, claiming, quote, irrefutable evidence of a multi-year intrusion. An NSA spokesman told Recorded Future News that the agency doesn't confirm or deny allegations in the media regarding its operations. I love that. As many of our listeners know, time is an unseen critical dependency. So GPS relies on it. Cell networks, the towers must be tightly aligned by microseconds so radios don't step on each other. In financial markets, trades are sequenced by timestamp. The power grid relies on it for phase synchronized measurements, PMUs. And if that timing drifts and it gets into the wrong phase, that could hurt the load balancing and cause massive blackouts. And also in internet and data use, security protocols, logs, distributed database, etc. If you skew those up, then you can corrupt the logs and create data conflicts. And all this news arrives as Western advisories continue to warn about China-linked campaigns against our own critical infrastructure. And my question is, do we have time to talk about this?
We don't, but I will add one tease so that we force ourselves to come back at this because I think talking cyber is always fun and relevant. So here's my one tease. Wow, this is weird. Not necessarily that it was done. I'm not on the inside, so I have no idea, but nation states do things to nation states. It is really unusual for China to publicly make this claim. So
Huh.
mine is, why now? What are they thinking? What advantage do they think they're getting by doing this? So we'll explore this and other topics when we get back around to cyber. But it's, you described it really well. Time is the new oil in cyber. Everything depends on timing. But I find it really unusual that they made this public claim. It's different for them.
Yeah. Okay. I'll leave it there. Many questions, but I'll leave it there.
I know. See, I'm teasing you this time. Usually you poke Sue. This time Sue's poking Eric. No, I think this is, I don't have a sure answer to it.
Yeah.
This is weird behavior by China. So I want to talk through why people do things, why you make something publicly known or when you keep it to yourself, and kind of the history of nation state on nation state actions different from some of the criminal civil tussles that we have. Also
Yeah.
ties, and you didn't mention it, to our quantum talk 2 times ago, which is one of the reasons why everyone's so excited about that aspect of quantum technology is, can we get away from the timing approach we've used on GPS for the longest time, which is vulnerable. So fascinating. We'll get back at this, promise.
Doctor Strange is the strongest Avenger.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, there you go.
All right. Well, that's a few things that you're watching. I'll
Yeah.
see you watching moving into next week.
I want to be watching the government shutdown. These are real humans. You're about to have your second paycheck. You don't even have the Congress coming back. You have the president saying, I don't have to. Like I say, I can see my way clear to exactly how I'd do it, even if I were in President Trump's shoes, but I don't see any motion on that part, which suggests to me there's a different reasons that you want to keep the people shut out. But just my former colleagues and people that serve, hang in there. There are a lot of resources. What you do matters, even if it's harder every day. I'm also, Venezuela bothers me. I think there's some other shoes to drop there.
Yep. Carrier Strike Group moved into the area.
Carrier Strike Group moved into the area. There seems to be no apology, nor abatement, nor any succumbing to pressure. Boy, this is one that falls into the category of we should be having a national discussion about this, and there ought to be some oversight on this. I don't know that there will be, so I think that's worth watching. And then there's just all the perennials that you and I have talked about. I'd like to get back and look at what's happening with the states and their gerrymandering, because there seems to be some movement on
There's a
that.
few more. Yep.
Yeah, maybe we ought to talk about that. But really, the budget and the shutdown and Venezuela are the two that are top of mind for me right now.
Yeah.
How about you?
I think for me, continuing on in the Indo-Pacific, any talk about Taiwan and some of the other regional security that comes out of this most recent visit. And then I think you teased it earlier, but there's a number of interesting developments in cybersecurity and also tying into some election security type stuff that's been coming out in the past couple weeks as we are gearing up towards 2026.
Yeah, so I think yours and my job jar are filling up. I think we want to go back. We loved our time with Shannon Corliss so much when we talked about digital currency. I think we'd love to get a guest in to talk a little bit more about AI. I think that'd be really useful, especially it fits with our theme of going all the way to local in terms of where that
Yeah.
is. We'd like to talk a little bit more about healthcare. I wanted to pair that a little bit with the budget, but that just hasn't manifested. But I think we'd love to have someone come in and talk. And then we just have a bunch of other issues. I want to get back on farms and ranching. I want to get back on what are the real local issues. I'm really excited about the idea of multiple state consortium, the one that the West Coast with California, Washington, and Oregon have said that they're going to institute in terms of healthcare. And I think that's an interesting trend for us to watch. So you and I need to create time or actually get on all those things.
We'll keep rolling the Chinese clocks back. We'll
Yeah,
make more time.
there you go. There you go.
Yeah, no, I think the state and local is really interesting because how long are we going to put up with the federal government being so ineffectual and just spending money that we don't have, whereas the states returning to looking on themselves and developing a consortium or a confederation or a United States that works together for common purpose instead of all these national things. Of course, you have tremendous benefit for some national oversight. National military is tremendous. Having national regulation maybe across AI and different interstate commerce applications. But if you're going to keep being feckless and wasting money, we're not going to want to work with you anymore. We're not going to keep sending you our money.
And maybe that's the way that you rebuild it. Let's even take out any nefarious negative and just say that just volumetrically and the kinds of things that we're dealing with as a nation are almost too big to be dealt with first at the national level. And so if you want to
Yeah.
redesign systems, you probably have to first go back to state and local to say, since we are state-based, how do they want to do it? And what is it that builds from there? So I think that's the way that we are going to modernize how we govern these United States and how we give power and representation to the people. Even if you still have the idea of a big federal government, it has to look different. And I don't know how it looks different if you don't restart at the states. So I think we have a lot of room to cover. So maybe we'll do 1 or 2 more episodes, Eric.
All right. Well, it's great to have you back.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, that's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. Because this country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us each week. We're here for you. We believe in this country. We're trying to do our best for it and for you. So give us feedback on what you want to hear about, what we can do better, because we want to be better every day. Just remember, you can hear us anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And every day, go forth, do good, and remember to be kind to one another. Thanks.